In this video, I'm going to explain descriptors, show you what the different algorithms are and how to fine-tune them, and ultimately how to use them. But first, what are descriptors? Descriptors are meaningful information about the contents of an audio signal. Okay, so here we are inside of Max. So the first thing we're going to look at is different descriptor types. Now there's different types of descriptors in general, and there's different descriptors within Datanaught that we can compute. Some of them are good for certain things. So for example, we have these hybrid descriptors that have mainly perceptually relevant things. So like loudness, centroid, which is effectively brightness, flatness, which is effectively noisiness, and pitch. Then we have things that are useful for processes like classification or regression, where we have something like MFCCs, where these are a bunch of coefficients that correspond with kind of complex timbral shapes, but the numbers themselves don't really mean so much to me as a person. Then we have things like spectral shape, which can kind of give us a bit more of a detailed spectral contour and are somewhat perceptually relevant, but are different than what we have here. And then we have some kind of custom ones that are based on sort of meta descriptors. So if I play some of these again, we can kind of see the different descriptors and how they behave. Now, there's a bunch of information here if you want to dig into each one, or you can go to the help files for each descriptor here. But generally speaking, some have perceptual relevance, some are good for computational things, and some are somewhere, I guess, in between. It's not really that straightforward. So depending on what it is that you're interested in the signal, that's what the descriptor type that you'll choose to analyze with. So if I want to know how loud something is, or how bright it is, or if I want to use that information to have a neural network or a classifier differentiate between sounds, I can choose the descriptor type that I want that will best suit that. It's worth mentioning that descriptors are a very, very large area of research. So there's dozens upon dozens of different descriptor algorithms. These are all the ones that I'm using within Datanaught that come from Flucoma, which is the underlying package. You can find some more information about different descriptor types here on these papers and this webpage here. The descriptors in Datanaught might change in the future, but for the most part, I've chosen algorithms that work well within a real-time low latency situation. That's one of the big sort of focuses of the package. So all the algorithms that I've chosen to include are the ones that play nice in that context. So independent of the different descriptor type that you're analyzing, we can analyze descriptors in an onset-based way or a real-time way. So here I have the same audio going to a onset-based spectral shape analysis and a real-time one. The difference here being that the onset-based one will only analyze a frame of audio when an onset is detected, and the real-time one will do it in a continuous manner. So for example, in this bit here, where we have a long sustained kind of hiss, we'll only have a single analysis frame here at the top, but the bottom one will keep changing to follow that. So we'd use the approach based on what it is you're interested in doing. So for example, if I want to do some corpus-based matching, where I'm using descriptor analysis to find the nearest match within a body of samples, I would use the onset-based approach like this. Or if I'm interested in the continuous changes, I might use something like this, where here I have a real-time MFCC analysis. So independent of the type of descriptor you want to analyze, you can either do it in an onset-based manner or a continuous manner. So each one of the descriptor objects has multiple outputs. The leftmost object will give you a list output, meaning the values as literal numbers. The second outlet gives you the buffer output. So this is useful for passing it on to other processes, which I'll explain in a second. And then we have a trigger output and a gate output. Both of these are time aligned to the descriptor analysis. In order to analyze the descriptors, we need to analyze a window of time. So these trigger and gate outputs are compensated for that time period. So, okay, the buffer here doesn't look like it's changing because the buffer name is consistent, but the contents of the buffer are being updated every time there's an onset. Objects like descriptor display will work well with a list or a buffer input. So in terms of whether you want to use the list output or the buffer output, that depends on what you're doing with them. So for example, these up here will expect buffers at their input. Basically, the rule of thumb is if something is doing a complex process like matching or querying or something like that, you will use the buffer output. So corpus match, class create, cluster create, all of these want the buffer output. If you're doing something with where you want to map things or use the values to control specific parameters, you would then use the list output. So in terms of fine-tuning the analysis, there's a few things that we can do. One of the first things is changing the FFT size. The default settings within Datanaught always tend towards low latency real-time usage. So if you're interested in having really accurate pitch analysis in middle to low register, you might want to make the FFT settings a bit bigger. The trade-off is that you'll have slightly more latency, but it depends on what you're interested in. So here I've got some vocals. With the default FFT setting, it would track the pitch like this. So it's catching some of the notes. You can see the pitch confidence isn't really all that high all the time. It is very low latency, so it is tracking it very quickly, but once she goes into the lower pitches, we kind of lose some of that accuracy. If I switch to the larger FFT settings, so using this one here, it's finding those notes a lot better at the cost of ever so slight latency. So you probably hear a little bit of a delay with that. That's just a trade-off of frequency and time. So in addition to changing the different FFT settings, you could also change the history and the threshold for the real-time analysis objects. So the history is how many frames will be smoothed across. The default is 6, so that gives us a kind of responsive while still smooth output. So if I play some audio here, you can see it's kind of smooth. So if I put this down to 0, which will be no smoothing at all, you see it jumps around in a very jittery way. And if I put this really big, let's say like 20, it's very smooth, but it's missing the sudden changes. So 6 is the default, but you can move that up or down depending on what you want. And threshold is the point at which below it ignores audio. So default, it will be at negative 70 dB. So if I put this up to, let's say, 26 here, it stops during the quiet section. So you can kind of cut off the point at which it stops reporting information. So right now, even though it's analyzing in a real-time manner, because the audio is below a threshold, it's ignoring everything. If I put this all the way to the bottom, which is, this just displays infinity, but it's negative 70. You can see that even during that quiet section where the volume is very low, it's still reporting the noisiness and the centroid and the pitch of the information. So if I put this to maybe around 50, it kind of stops in the very quietest bit. Then some of the algorithms have additional parameters. So for example, Melbands has a minimum frequency and a maximum frequency range. So the way that Melbands works, it's finding 40 bands within that set of frequencies. So by default, it's 210K. So this is basically an EQ curve that's perceptually spaced within those frequency ranges. So if I change this, if I put this, let's say to 500, and I bring this down to 5K, it's still 40 bands, but it's within that narrower range. So you can adjust these values based on what you want. There's a kind of a point of diminishing return. So if I put this between, let's say like 1000 and 5K, that's only like 4000 hertz in between those. So it'll space the things, but you know, the amount of information I'm going to get from there is not super useful. So generally speaking, 210K is good, but if you're interested in a certain frequency range, you might want to fine tune this where, let's say I only want from 200 to 5K. Now that's using the same 40 bands, but spacing it accordingly. So if you want a bit of a deep dive on how FFT windowing works within Datanaught, this is the way that I analyze stuff. So if I set this to none, this is the audio I want to analyze, and then this is the analysis window that I'm going to apply to it. There's windowing applied to each frame. So really only the center of this frame would be analyzed at full volume, meaning the very start and the very end are going to be very weak here. In FFT analysis, this tends to be the default, where we have half a window before we analyze. So here's the window I want to analyze. the first frame of analysis is such that it's centered where the loudest bit happens here, and then it carries on. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames that correspond with this specific time period I want to analyze. Now this is better in that every bit is analyzed from the beginning to the end. But what happens here is that this first chunk of audio, this first hop, is analyzed 3 times. You can see it sort of like full volume, fading up, and then fading up more quietly. The second frame, however, is analyzed 4 times, coming down, going up, and then going up more. This frame is also 4 times, and then this last frame is 3 times. So the default FFT analysis for basically every audio library works this way. So you get a good representation from the beginning to the end, but the middle 2 frames are weighted a bit more. So with the full panning mode, each hop, so this chunk of audio here, is analyzed 4 times, as is this one, as is this one, and as is this one. So for this chunk of audio that I want to analyze, I'm actually analyzing 7 frames of audio to make sure every hop within that frame is analyzed the same amount of times. So different descriptor types have different units and different ranges for them. It varies on descriptor type, and for the most part, I try to have everything where things are in units that are comparable, meaning loudness is in dB, so let's say roughly from -100 to 0, and then a lot of things that are frequency-based are in MIDI. So centroid maybe from 0 to 127. So even though these are in different ranges, it corresponds such that 1 dB is roughly perceptually equal to 1 MIDI note. So where possible, I have units that are sort of comparable. That's the general idea here. So here you can see the ranges, the units and the ranges for everything. Descriptors, mel bands are a little bit more abstract. They're from 0 to 1. MFCCs are coefficients, kind of odd. Spectral shape vary between MIDI, ratio, and dB. And then here's all the descriptor types in a single dictionary. So this is useful if you want to map things. So you can see what signs are in, what controllers are in, what speed are in, what descriptors, mel bands, MFCCs, etc. So all the descriptor analysis within Datanaught uses a frame-based approach. So here I have dk.descriptors. So if I send audio into this, I can see the loudness, the centroid, flatness, and pitch. Now, what's inside of dk descriptors is onset frame and then descriptor frame. Now, where this is useful is, let's say I want to analyze descriptors, mel bands, MFCCs, spectral shape, a bunch of different descriptors, but I don't want to do multiple sets of onset detection. If I have different settings in each one, I don't want each descriptor to correspond to a different moment in time. So in this case, everything within this red box corresponds to the same exact moment, sample accurately. So if I'm interested in analyzing multiple descriptors, what's useful to do is use a single onset frame and then a descriptor frame for each one of the descriptors that you're interested in analyzing. So descriptor frame, mel band frame, MFCC frame, spectral shape frame, etc. And the same thing applies for when we're doing classification. So here I have class match that's coming directly from MFCC frame, or I can take it directly from MFCC, or class MFCCs, which is the combination of the two. So all of these are identical. So depending on the kind of thing that you're analyzing and how many parallel descriptors you're analyzing, it may be useful to use the frame-based versions of objects as opposed to the combined ones. So all the descriptor objects have these various input modes. So the input modes let you tailor the onset detection separately from the audio analysis. So this is primarily useful where you want to use one type of microphone for onset detection specifically, and then a separate microphone for the audio analysis. So let's say I have a drum trigger, so a contact mic, which is going to be good for isolating the sound and picking up onsets very clearly, but the audio quality from a contact mic might not be as good as something like a DPA microphone or something along those lines. So by default, everything is set to input 0, which assumes nothing. So there's just, let's say, a microphone coming in or your guitar cable or whatever it is. If you have sensor percussion hardware, either the version 1 or version 2 or a 3D printed alternative, you can set this to input 1 and plug that into the first input. And what that'll do is it'll apply a filter to that audio such that the onset detection happens more accurately while leaving the audio that's being analyzed for descriptors unprocessed. Similarly, if you have a contact mic either as a drum trigger or just a contact mic that you're using any other way, you set this to input 2 and that'll give you better onset detection from the contact mic. And as with a sensor percussion, it'll leave the audio unprocessed for the descriptor analysis itself. all of these along the bottom will let you use different inputs depending on what it is you want to focus on. So this is a setup that I use very often, where I'll use a sensor percussion sensor as the onset detection, and the second input I often use as a DPA 4099 going into the second input as my audio analysis. So what this does is it gives me the best of both worlds, where I have the accurate onset detection from the sensor percussion sensor, but then the audio and descriptor analysis from the DPA microphone. Input 4 is the same exact thing, but for piezo. So again, just the input onset detector filter is changed here. Then we have input 5, which gives you two separate microphones. So let's say I have an SM57 as a close mic, and then I have a different microphone as an overhead. This will give me clear onsets, and then I get my audio analysis from here. And then finally, input 6 is specific to the sensor percussion hardware, where you set it to input 6, plug into the first input. And what this will do, it'll apply a filter to the onset detection, and then it'll apply microphone correction to the sensor percussion audio, so the descriptors that you get are more representative of what the actual audio is. And to show this in context, here I have DK descriptors with input 1, input 3, and input 6. So for just the sensor percussion hardware, I can see that I got the onset, that worked right, and it's reporting the centroid as being quite high and the flatness being at quite high. Using input 3, this is using the sensor percussion for the onset detection, but then a DPA for the audio analysis. So here with a better microphone, I can see that the centroid is not quite as high, nor is the flatness. The loudness is comparable, but it's not exactly the same. So that's the different input modes. So once you've done your descriptor analysis, there are different transformations that you can apply. So here I have a DK descriptors at the top with a slightly bigger FFT window and very high sensitivity. So this can come out, and we get that. So I can use descriptor curves to change the units and the curve of any specific descriptor within that. So let's say I want to change dB to amplitude. So that'll change there. Or if I want to change it to velocity, so like a MIDI range from 0 to 127. And I can also change the curve of it, making it more responsive or less responsive, like you can do with velocity curves in most things. And that applies to the loudness, the centroid, or the flatness or pitch. So I can also use something like descriptor replace to replace specific descriptors within an analysis frame. So in this case, I'm analyzing the cello here for all the descriptors, but I want to replace the pitch information with this sequence of notes. So rather than getting the pitch analysis from the cello itself, it's going to be these pitches based on this sequence, which you can use to do some interesting things with. Next, we have a couple data manipulation objects. So data transpose will let you just sort of transpose the data that's coming in. So I can sort of move everything up or down by a certain percentage. You can also move each descriptor independently, but it has a global transpose, which depending on descriptor type can be quite interesting. Everything gets moved down accordingly. And then something like data bending, which will let you transform and kind of, well, I guess bend the data. So by default, it's set to a certain amount of variation. So it'll take the descriptors as they're coming in and then vary the data plus minus, well, 10%, but 20% overall. I can also rotate the data, which depending on the type of descriptors used will produce very wild results. So you can see here things are off the chart in terms of the display, but the numbers will come out fine. Something like scramble will reorder them. Resolution is kind of like bit crushing, but for data. So this will have the values all kind of quantized to things. And then finally dropouts, which will make a certain amount of the events not go through at all. So here 70% of the events will not pass through. So all of these will take the descriptors as you analyze them, apply some kind of useful utility type functionality by changing the curves and the units in between them or altering them, or you can get more creative and a little bit more bizarre with bending and transforming the data in different ways. And finally, here are some use cases within data not for descriptors. So for this top one, I'm using descriptors to find the nearest match within a corpus of samples. So basically a large body of samples. I'm giving it beatboxing and I'm having the descriptor analysis find the nearest match of a China cymbal. In this one here, I'm using MFCCs to differentiate between the types of sounds from the beatboxing, whether it's a kick sound, a snare, or a hat sound, and play samples accordingly. In this one, I'm taking the descriptor analysis, which I trained a regressor with to navigate synth parameters. Here I'm doing the same thing, but in a real-time manner. Here I'm using descriptor analysis to do concatenative synthesis, so basically like audio mosaicing. And here I'm using descriptors to navigate a buffer of audio. So if I play a sample back, every time there's an onset, it'll change the direction of the sample, or change the octave, or jump around the sample. So that's an overview of descriptors within Datanaut.